process and I've done it right. We're recording. Okay. Yes. So this is the last of the reading groups that we had planned for 2018, and the theme is justice. And I think we all know each other on this call at this point. Does that sound right? I believe so. So I'm gonna say, unless someone requests it, and please do so in the chat, we're gonna actually maybe skip the introduction section. And then I'll maybe just do a little bit of setup for what we were supposed to talk about today. And also hand off to Matt for a chunk of that. So I think we wanted to talk about justice because, especially coming from the edgy side, but also you know, in the work that a lot of folks in this space do, people are interested in and use the language of social justice or thinking about what is just and equity, in understanding any approach that we want to take in terms of access to data, or I don't know, even like building decentralized technologies maybe. But that maybe that was like our understanding of it was like a little soft, or there was like a lot there. So it was like trying to just like grapple with that. So this week might be a little bit more distant from a specific technical topic. But I think maybe we should talk about even that distance. And I was, as I was saying before I started recording, we haven't, I did not put any sort of like overarching themes or questions in, mostly because I didn't give myself enough time. But I would encourage you all to do so, and the hack pad is there. And actually what I thought might be a good start, and people can kind of fill in from there, is if we, and I've asked Matt to kind of help with this, just to try to provide a little bit of background on the people we're reading this time, because that might kind of help frame a little bit. I mean, it actually felt like they were kind of addressing each other some more closely, as in like Nussbaum and Rawls, but even I think the Tuck and Yang piece kind of has something to say to what Rawls and Nussbaum's sort of articulation is. And then the last one, which was the two-way streets from Diana and Nusera, was I think the quote like a practitioner like way of working with stuff, which I think was brought up in some of the other readings. So I thought the order that we could do that in would just maybe be, I could just say, I don't have much more to say than I just did, but I will a little bit more about Tuck and Yang and that piece, what justice wants, and then also the two-way streets, and then hand off to Matt to take us into philosophy. Yeah, so Matt, Zed.
Well, in the previous calls, it's been really fruitful doing I don't know if we did this as part of the intros, but we would sort of go around and just give our reflections on the readings before we dove into it. I don't know if we want to do that before Matt provides context or after, but it's always nice hearing like where everyone's coming from, just like first blush.
Yeah, totally. So can I put it to people, maybe just a head nod or a thumbs up? Would you prefer if we start with reflections or a brief context setting? So reflections before context setting, thumbs up or head nod. I'm seeing medium number of head nods and stuff. So why don't we do that to keep just, okay, brief reflections. Yeah, like how about I do a more facilitator time box mode? So let's aim for like an initial reflection. And thank you to our scribe and others to chip in to make sure we note the key parts that we want to return to. So maybe I'll just open the floor to people who want to share their reflections. Yeah, go, Matt, please.
I do feel like these pieces fall kind of nicely into two categories. We have the Rawls and Nussbaum on the one hand, which aim to serve as an introduction to the frameworks that guide, professional philosophical reflection on justice in the early 21st century. And then we have these other two pieces that are engaging with justice around different kinds of action for the talk piece, I think it's around what does reconciliation look like, really? And for the other, it's about, it brings us back to technology. So I think if we kind of think of our conversations going that way with frameworks and then understanding how to use them, how to instrumentalize them, I think that'd be good.
Yeah, I definitely take that point. Other people have an initial thought, and it doesn't even have to be about where the conversation is. Maybe just like what you felt reading them. Did you like them? Were they easy to read? How do they compare to Chum? Yeah, go Kelsey.
I was really excited to read the Nussbaum piece, and specifically, I hadn't seen anyone critique the idea of the social contract in that way before, as like specifically being the basis for people talking about like people who aren't contributing enough to society being leeches on society type of stuff. I think that's a really cool framing with the idea like that it goes back to the whole concept of building a society as being about everyone contributing to mutual advantage. And then if you're not contributing, then, or if you're not contributing equally, or if you're not contributing in the same way, then it becomes this justification for, well, then maybe you're not part of my society. And I think that's a really interesting way of looking at that.
Yeah, I totally viewed the Nussbaum piece as like a dessert. It was the treat after doing all the other reading. So I was glad it was last. I always try to read these in the order that you put them in, because you tend to have like a great intentionality of the arc of them. This one definitely was almost like a study in how that can influence how you read a piece, because to open up Rawls' piece after having just read the like critical theory perspective, that was sort of like the whole notion of justice is sort of this difficult construct that's maybe impossible, and then to open up Rawls, who's like, let's construct a theory of justice based on a veil of ignorance and pretend that people can be purely objective. And so it was like it totally had this what would be the word, like reluctance to buy in to reading what he was saying, because I was coming from this, it's all corrupt. And so that was actually kind of delightful to see in its framing. Oh, the other thing I wanted to throw in is like when I first entered into this section of reading, I had just listened to a podcast where it was the Atlantic podcast where they were interviewing DeRay McKeeson, and he just in there he had this like offhanded comment where he said justice is what happens after the trauma has happened, and accountability is what happens to prevent the trauma no, accountability is what happens when the trauma has already happened. Justice is what happened when in order to prevent the trauma from happening at all. And it was just like that was sort of echoing in my head when I started this reading of like the way that justice was defined there, and it was sort of perpendicular to any of the other definitions of justice that bubbled up in here, which was kind of nice to keep that tension there. On the ground, people use this term in so many different ways.
Any other, Rico? Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Coming as I am to this from a sort of professional context, working on a very technical product that and service and tool that I feel comfortable making the case can help a lot of interesting problems in communities. I was really struck by, I think my favorite quote from the Nussbaum piece, civil technologists should begin by identifying communities that are already working on difficult problems. And I like that a lot as a reorientation for not just me, but for anybody else who's working on this stuff, to make sure that there's a problem that technology is being applied to solve from the start, from as much of the start as you can. And I think that helps, A, save a lot of time and make sure you're solving the right problem. B, develop a lot of trust with the communities that are working to solve that problem. And C, kind of part of the first two, allows you to avoid a lot of the really uncomfortable retrofitting of values from the technology that's already being built back onto the problems that it says it's going to solve. And I think that once you find yourself doing that, making those retrofitting arguments, you're trying to skip quite a lot of the legwork of working alongside a community to work on a problem that was really required. So I've liked that as like a North Star for my work anyway.
Anyone else? I mean, I can just say this is like a observation more about reading it. I have read both Rawls and Nussbaum before, and kind of the area I focused on in philosophy was ethics, but I actually felt like a really big roadblock reading this stuff. I don't know why. I was saying to Matt today, for some reason, it's like a thing that I put a lot of distance between is reading philosophy after I finished my undergrad. So I always actually find it a bit difficult to return. I feel like I almost don't have access to the text in the same way. That's like a side comment. But it was really great to read them alongside each other. Like I think this was a nice, it kind of gave me some way to think in on that maybe. Any other opening thoughts, or do we want to maybe just move into, I mean, I think also hopefully a still brief, a bit of a background. And I
flooded the chat just because I don't want to derail too early, but those points were what came to mind for me.
Awesome, thanks, Jeremy. So I just telling you and skimming them because I haven't read them all right now, but these kind of feel like they might be great after a bit of an intro, but let's copy them into the notepad. So, and I'll just say for the intro of what I was going to say is like literally 2 to 3 minutes. So we'll start there and then I'll hand off to Matt. So, I mean, it was a little bit intentional, Method, as you said, to start with the Huck and Yang piece. And maybe that was an unfair priming, but that was kind of coming out of that What Justice Wants article, which has been reread as part of the Environmental Data Justice Working Group in EDGI, and that, along with some of Eve Tuck's other work, has really been kind of helpful to think through some of the writing that's been going on in the EDGI, EDJ, all those acronyms group recently. And so let me just jump to the section where I wrote some other stuff. Okay, so I mean, and some of this kind of comes out of the biography and the intro part of the article, but so this was like the intro to a journal issue, and it's like a pretty new journal called Critical Ethnic Studies. And I think, so Eve is actually based here at University of Toronto and is a Ganex scholar. And so like Matt said, I think is really largely concerned with sort of the status of the truth and reconciliation, or what that's looking like in, you know, the settler colonial context of Canada. And her work is sort of, I would say, takes a explicitly like activist approach, and she works with youth in sort of these projects that sort of, I would say, kind of do work on the academy and also are not like fully contained within it. And so I think they have this line in the intro, which I think is like a way of understanding the context, or a frame that they're using when they're writing, which is sort of activist intellectualism, but that sort of their commitments are prioritizing, you know, like Indigenous, they think Eve Tech uses land/life, Black, queer lives, as well as sort of decolonization, and taking that as sort of, I feel like like a commitment in their work and trying to sort of carry that through. So, I mean, I don't want to say too much more, but then to just add to that, Diana Ucera is the director of the Detroit Community Technology Project. There are also a lot of acronyms there, which is associated with Allied Media Project and has really been a part of that organization. So I think Allied Media Project is probably the umbrella organization in her case as well, and it's been there for many years, at least 5 or 6 that I had met that are working there, and has really focused on what I would say like community forms of research. So this is not kind of coming from, you know, explicitly like an academic, and I think is explicitly not written in an academic way, because they do large scale research projects as part of the Detroit Community Technology Project, including on open data, but they're really concerned about writing this stuff for community members and or like other people in other communities. And a huge part of what Diana talks about in that article is kind of like a synthesis of a very long community-driven consultation, or consultation isn't the right word, community-driven process to develop these principles of digital justice. And I put the extra links for the principles of digital justice that she also mentions in the article, but in parallel to that, there's sort of these design justice principles that I would say were kind of like cultivated in the same networks. So Allied Media Project hosts a conference annually, Allied Media Conference in Detroit. So I think it started someone else and they relocated there like 15 years ago. And sort of that space is really about like activists who are interested in media strategies and organizing from across the space, but I think increasingly international folks. And so it kind of that articulation, that process of articulating digital justice principles kind of spawned these other ways of like using that language of justice to guide organizing work. And sort of people have been carrying that in these sort of similar but slightly different contexts. That was all I wanted to say about those two, if that might help provide a bit of a frame. And I wonder if Matt might want to take us to talking about Rawls.
Yeah, sure. How many people have like knew anything about Rawls before? So most people. And does that mean that you felt totally comfortable reading it? Or yeah. So we have here two of the most prominent philosophers of the late 20th century in this domain. I'm not a moral philosopher or a political philosopher, and so like it's not like I'm some kind of expert here. And I mean, it was kind of interesting thinking about this. Like Nussbaum started to become an important figure in moral philosophy as opposed to classics around the time that I stopped my coursework. So like I know Rawls in one way and I know Nussbaum in a totally different, much less thorough way. So Rawls's theory of justice is the work around which political philosophy in America pivots in the last quarter of the 20th century, and is something that any analytic philosopher who believes in liberal democracy has to engage with one way or another. I think what's most important for us about reading Rawls is not that we like totally come to grips with it or that we agree or disagree with it, but that we see how the concept of justice becomes much more difficult to understand once you start to look at it closely. So you can kind of feel the notion of justice itself, I think, is slipping away from you a little bit when you watch Rawls. So that's one thing. And the second is the importance of this sort of founding myth of the original position in the veil of ignorance. And we can talk. I guess I don't feel like I want to give some kind of lecture about Rawls, although if the time comes, I'm sure I will do it anyway. But just to say that like myth, which occupies a position kind of analogous to Plato's cave in his work, as this like image, and Don and I were saying it's almost like watching a movie, like you watched a movie of it. We have that feeling of the like hazy veil and the kind of for me, I see the like rays behind the veil peering out into the world, imagining themselves in it. So that plays a really important part in philosophical discussion in the 40 years since then, or so, 30 years, 40. And we can say about it that it is derived, like it comes in a lineage from other contract theories, but it's quite different from contract theories that came before them. It doesn't, like Hobbes, for instance, posit that there was some real contract once on which our society is actually founded, but instead that a contract is the abstract model upon which we should understand, we should ground our notion of what justice might be. And so we use this imaginary contracting scenario as a way to kind of articulate the conception of justice and the bounds of a just society. And okay, so I don't want to, how's that feel, people? Is that good enough for Rawls? And then about Nussbaum, that, it was in the last decade, really, of the 20th century that she became a really important figure in ethics. Before then, she had been a very prominent classicist, and I remember her that way a little bit. And the kind of theoretical framework with which she is associated was also put forward, was put forward first by Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize-winning economist and philosopher whose 1973 book on famine is like one of the coolest things to read, actually, still. Rawls's book is a kind of like reinvigoration of contract theory against utilitarianism, and maybe we can talk about what it means to be against utilitarianism. And the capabilities approach is also anti-utilitarian. So these are two frameworks that had been developed in response to what I think the authors saw as an overreaching kind of caricatured position that had become dominant in philosophy, partly because of its unholy intersections with economy through rational actor theory and game theory. So the capabilities approach, I think we should talk about it more, but tries to understand a just society in terms of the real capacities that that society affords to its citizens, or the people who live in that society. And it takes issue with Rawls largely around the way in which the Rawlsian view depends on a notion of fundamental equality of capacity. And so it tries to take into account the reality of difference in a serious way. So that's kind of like the insight or problem or whatever from which capability theory, the capabilities approach seems to proceed. Anyway, so that was a lot already. So I think too much. Matt, I see your hand up. You want to go?
Well, just a question of that particular thing, because I haven't read a lot of Nussbaum, and what we did read just left me wanting to read the whole book. So clearly that book is framed around people who are with disability, nationality, and species membership. But does she also reach to apply that to other forms of differences in power and capability? So like economic and political influence and the ways that those influence people, like justice? Or is she like steering clear?
I can answer that a little bit. Does anybody else want to say something who knows potentially quite a bit more than me? But I have an answer. Okay, I'll go. I'll read Jeremy's thing in a sec. Yeah, totally. So capabilities are related to economics. So capabilities are beings and doings, the two classifications of capabilities. Like, so you can be comfortable in your house. That's a capability, the capacity to be comfortable in your house. Or you can vote, the capacity to go out and do and participate in voting. That's also like a capability. So Sen, starts from a question about like how you have a functioning economic system that also, provides some measure of justice. So economics is kind of at the heart, actually, of the undertaking. And before she did this book, she wrote another book that his name is escaping me right now, about sex, sexuality, and justice. And so she's really interested. So she sort of begins from a kind of feminist position about equality between men and women, or fairness, justice, as it relates to the distribution of capabilities between men and women in a given society. So which is also a different kind of question. I don't know if that answers your question.
So I feel like that as a intro is actually maybe enough to get us going to kind of like talk around a couple areas that kind of are of most interest to us, and we can kind of thicken or backfill with what we can if we're kind of led in a certain direction. I want to recall one thing that Jeremy said at the top, which was something I wanted to talk about and kind of feels like a pretty big node, so I'm not sure the right way to handle it. But it's kind of this like moving into practice of abstract theories, or almost like how do you apply it, or how do you imagine like something that is maybe put forward as like a original position behind a veil of ignorance, sort of like Rawlsian argument. And so I think there was a quote that I wanted to pull up, which I am not coming from, or not coming upon right now. Oh, okay, yeah. So actually, it was a quote from the Two-Way Streets article. And it was sort of like, hey, sometimes we like to talk about the public in its abstract, or like maybe a philosophical understanding of the public. And this isn't coming from here, this is like, say, Dewey. It's like people spend a lot of time thinking in the abstract about like how publics get interested and form around an issue, or like people spend a lot of time thinking in the abstract about like what would have to be these two principles of justice, like a theory of justice. Yet it's kind of just so much harder to like get group of people around a table. So I think there's like this divide of like, you know, like there's sort of a practical or a practitioner, like what matters when we think about justice, and maybe like how we want to theorize about it, and kind of like how do you grapple that, or how do you navigate that, and how do you like, what are the benefits of either? Like that's kind of something I wanted to check in on with folks, because I think these readings kind of threw that up. And so I think that was kind of Jeremy's original one. It sounded, Jeremy, like there in the 4 that you mentioned, there's some kind of like really specific, I'm not quite sure I understand one of them, but it kind of feels like it's like some pretty deep engagement with some aspects of Rawls. And I think that could be valuable to folks if people want to like dig in a little bit to some key aspects of Rawls's account. I mean, I think there is a piece of that which would be kind of helpful, which is maybe not, which is that, but also thinking about like, and this came up more in Nussbaum, actually like the way that social contract theory kind of is sometimes implicitly like carried through in a lot of ways we think about things. So Nussbaum says, you know, when we talk about people like not doing their fair share or not contributing to society, like we kind of almost metaphorically rely on this sort of contractual view of like our relationship to each other. So I mean, there's a piece there that I think might be also okay to talk about. Do people have other threads or a specific question or a thing they didn't understand that they want to make sure we touch on? Yeah, go Matt said.
Jeremy mentioned this too, and I threw it in the topics, just this connection between this notion of contractualism and then all the enthusiasm around smart contracts, and this sort of that seems especially relevant for this discussion group to at least touch on.
Yeah, can we talk a little bit about Rawls's contract? There's, I think, something really important in I mean, this is a little bit of like of retrospective thinking, but there's something that feels kind of inevitable about the extreme abstraction of Rawls's framing of this problem. Like he wants there to be an account of justice that is compelling and around which we can organize our societies. So like this is going to be the first virtue of social organization, right? It's the thing that matters before everything else matters. And other people have done that, and there have been problems with the kinds of things they've done. And he thinks he can get along around those problems by abstracting more and more. So kind of the problem with social contract theory is that it's about particular societies. And what we need to do is abstract the notion of a contract. But in order to do that, we also have to abstract the idea of the notion of the contractees, right? Of the people who are engaged in the contract. And they become less and less person-like in his account, right? I mean, so these entities that are contracting in the original position behind the veil of ignorance not only don't have sex or class, but ultimately they don't have proclivities, right? Like they don't have specific things that they're more interested in than other things. Because if they did, then they wouldn't be sufficiently generic in order to be able to make the right call, the right abstracted call about how we should organize society. And while all of this, I think, can seem extremely remote from practical concerns, it feels to me like it shows a weakness in the idea of justice itself as a governing principle. And it kind of feels like something that Tuck was after in that small piece where they say justice like can become a hegemonic force in the way that we think about how we ought to organize activism. And maybe that's a problem, they're saying. Anyway, it seems to me like that justice becomes a problem for Rawls. And he gets he organizes his thoughts so much about it that the things he's talking about are no longer people and could no longer be in the world. All right? You have these wraiths that are making decisions about what kind of world we should live in.
Go, Matt, Zed.
So one of my strategies for keep continuing to read in Rawls, because I was feeling like sort of just not into his whole approach, this like abstraction, like without a means of deployment. I was sort of reading it as, well, if you read this as designs for, okay, there are some sci-fi novels that set up this idea of if you had artificially intelligent machines that basically figured out a form of justice and tricked humans into operating in a just society, then like it's the one possible way that you could pull off a just society. And that like reading it, and so there are a couple of novels that explore that. And so it's like, oh, well, if you read this whole thing as basically a stab at designing the ethical system that you could, that an artificially intelligent thing, which then doesn't have proclivities and doesn't have sex and doesn't have gender, could then execute, it's like you'd almost get a cleaner version of what he's saying if you wrote it that way. If you just said, oh, well, the only way that this could actually happen is if you actually had something that's not human interpreting it. Because otherwise I just like kept coming back to like, how the heck are you going to execute this? Like, what's the point of all this abstract consideration if there's no way to land it and actually build a just society?
But it's supposed to be a tool for him, right? I mean, I'll take the other side here. You're supposed to say, well, how do I know what a just society is? I'm going to, I want to build a just society, but I'm actually not sure how to do it because I don't know which society is more just. The way I compare societies is by pretending that I'm in the original position and asking which of these possible worlds makes me works on the Maximin principle for me, so that since I don't know who I'm going to be in this world, what I want is to be is for the worst position to be in its best, to be at the worst off people to be in the best possible position. And that's how I'm going to evaluate these different worlds. So you can apply this principle, to a policy choice, like which version of the legislation do you want to go with? I want to go with the Maximin version of the legislation.
Okay, I'm going to try and make an argument in favor of the abstraction, which also rubs me the wrong way as well. And then maybe like a arc back to the Tuck and Yang piece. So how I was taught about Rawls and kind of what and where this theory of justice was coming from was in some way like a response to kind of the current format of social contract theories and the ways that they were insufficient. And the kind of most, I think the most striking one was sort of like the Hobbes version, where he gave kind of this like view of, like he kind of gave an imaginary and a similar, like a different kind of formation myth, but like similarly like this sort of like a myth of like how we got to be where we are in a society, which had like characterized a state of nature, which was like what is it? Like nasty, brutish, solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. And kind of like use that to justify like almost a sovereign that was coercive as being like the right thing to do because it's better than the alternative. And so in some ways like this, to try and navigate all of the potential pitfalls that critics of social contract theories had raised, Rawls puts forward a really kind of abstracted version, which kind of, I think sidesteps some of that by what the original position, like how that operates, as opposed to some of the other mechanics that were defined in other versions. And also is a more hopeful take on people. Like, I mean, I think some of the other philosophers who are in this space really so against utilitarianism, really had a model of how people would act around each other that this was sort of against. And so I think there's something about how, in comparison to some of the other social contract theories or other ways that justice was being talked about, it did some work. I mean, I think it kind of does that through this very universalizing notion of equality, or thinking with equality, that and that I think there has been critiques of a parallel way that equality has functioned in society. It's hey, if we start from this notion that everyone, it's equality versus equity, right? If we just start from this notion that everyone is equal, that's maybe missing the fact that there are lots of groups that aren't starting in the same place as cis white people due to historic disadvantages. So, I mean, I kind of feel there's a way that Tuck and Yang are not a direct response to Rawls point by point, but sort of some of the impulses or the ways that Rawls operate kind of make up this sort of way that justice is a colonial temporality. That was me trying to do a bridge. Didn't quite work. But I think Matt P has dropped some things in there, and I know Jeremy raised your hand. So maybe I'll hand off to Jeremy and then back to Matt P.
So one of the reasons why I wanted to write things down in part is that I think it's easy to, so my huge, I would say completely open biases toward pretty much open contempt of any morally or legally prescriptive sort of posturing that doesn't basically have skin in the game, in the sense of a philosopher prescribing that this is the way that things should be just, or a Supreme Court justice writing a dissenting opinion that basically is more about their vagaries and personal notions than what text they're supposed to be interpreting. So I find it very difficult to care too much about what might be the limitations of any of these systems beyond knowing how to fall into and out of them productively. I don't see there a need to have the capital C correct theory, capital T, of X in a case where you effectively know that there can be no perfect universalist system, and so you're really more. It seems like the more practical concerns have very little to do with whether this self-contained thing is self-consistent, etc. I mean, we're not talking about arithmetic or deriving math from logic or something. We're talking about things where you effectively know that you need ways to take up a certain framework at certain times, to reject it at other times, and to navigate in between the models. You need a model zoo, and this is just basically objective fact, whether you like or dislike the sense of so whether you, for instance, feel that it's dehumanizing to model agents. I mean, if you give that up for yourself, someone else will do it, and they're not necessarily going to have a charitable model of you agent sub you. When they do that, there's going to be this analytic pressure to have a system that models people as little game pieces, effectively, whether you want to participate in that or otherwise. And so I don't really see much value in addressing the critical theorist sort of view of questioning the validity of for instance, discussing abstractions that are supposed to be stand-ins for people, when people who basically determine what happens in reality, the consequences of legal proceedings, the consequences of all kinds of things, they're perfectly happy to do that. They don't need to care about what critical theorists think. They need to care about whatever pressures they have on them to actually enact the system. And so your best alternative to some sort of like negotiated agreement is not just to give up the sense of trying to have a better model or a more applicable model. It's to posit that there is a better model in this particular context.
Can I, I'm not 100% sure I'm following, but can I say it back to you in my words? Because I think you're hitting on a point that I was sort of really stuck on as well. And then maybe we can get to the sidebar chat that Matt said indicated interest in.
I wasn't terribly articulate. I'm also I'm really grumpy when I see people whose systems would somehow maybe dictate an outcome in the world, but who don't really have to see the consequences through them. I really distrust that sort of writing a lot. So I'm sort of being overly paranoid and hostile to a lot of these things.
Yeah, so I mean, kind of what I was sort of imagining you're pointing out is sort of the role of theory or theorizing and bringing things, conditions in the world, like bringing things into the world or leaving bad things. So you kind of said you think it's important in any account to sort of have a way you fall in and out of it. So in this case, imagining, I think what you're kind of treating as a model, I would maybe use the term like theory. So, you know, if Rawls is providing this this theory, but like if there's no way that it talks about like how from actual conditions do people get into it and leave it, or I mean, and then that could also be maybe applied in other work that maybe has like a normative or sort of like like we should be doing X. I'm saying this is the better alternative, but they don't tell you how to get there. Like that's something to flag. I mean, I think there's a part that I would offer another piece to that, which is almost like, I think sometimes having a model of a thing can be helpful to understand what's going on in the world. So like, I mean, I think the way that you could say, hey, by critiquing, I can evaluate things in a different way. Like, I think there's other ways that models or theory could operate, and maybe they're not helpful in this type of domain. Like maybe they're helpful in other, when you're talking about other things and maybe not like moral or ethical areas. But then also it's sort of like the degree of specificity, any like theorizing or talking about a thing you want to have. Like, should it describe material conditions? Should it be so abstract that it can be applied in many other domains that we can't even think of yet?
Yeah. So the way that the way that I would characterize my distinction there is, I think, for instance, it's pretty easy to state that. So, for instance, a theory of change is a useful thing to think about, and comparing and contrasting theories of change is useful in the sense that that is a thing that you are trying to put forth or trying to characterize, and it determines your activity. But I see that as in contrast to theories of justice, where you're talking about maybe someone else in some faraway land, and you have to presuppose some sort of things like moral universals that how do you know what people in Ghana think about a certain like moral attitude? Have you done empirical research? Do you know that you're coming from any position where you have a sense, if you're talking about a theory of change, you have a sense that that something needs changing, and you're trying to go about parameterizing a good way to do it. But with the theory of justice, it seems like a pretty hard line for me in terms of which one is clearly worthy of respecting as a thing to think about hard, and which one seems almost nonsensical.
Yeah, no, I mean, Eric, I'm wondering if I can invite you to speak a little bit to the point you just dropped there, because I think there's a nice flow into kind of some of the ways that Tuck and Yang talk about justice, or how people use justice, and then maybe we could circle back to like Tuck and Yang alongside Nussbaum. That was my attempt at.
Sure. I don't know if I can make the Nussbaum connection, because unfortunately I did not make it to Nussbaum, but no, this was just one of the quotes that really struck me from the Tuck and Yang article, which, yeah, I think also comes up a lot in this conversation about what is the concept of justice for, and what are we doing with it when we engage with it. And yeah, when I got to this point in the Tuck and Yang article, it felt like that is where I could really latch on to both to their argument against justice, or about the limits of justice, as well as how have alternatives to justice been operationalized and are being operationalized through these specific theories of change, and so yeah, and it really also grounds this point that that we have been making about Rawls, and how the veil of ignorance and the original position are abstractions that move us away from real people and their material concerns. So this is a really striking, really central paragraph for me.
Yeah, so that's the one. It's sort of in the conclusion, I think, on 9, the section Elsewhere is Beyond Justice. And I just tried to drop some of the theories of change that they mentioned.
I mean, just to expand just a little bit more, and I don't actually know what to say about this, but maybe something we haven't talked a whole lot about yet is the temporality of justice, which is something they're really concerned with here, and comes up when we talk about theories of change. And justice is something that is posited into the future, and the limits of that way of thinking about justice, but then also the limits to thinking about justice in terms of how they put it, Tuck and Yang put it, the inherent story arc where you start with the injustice and then move towards justice. That was another really interesting bit of this article for me, was what I think Tuck talks about elsewhere as kind of damage-oriented approaches to research and to justice. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I think there was a couple other parts, like sort of when they're kind of unpacking what they mean about the temporal aspects of justice, kind of what you say, they sort of speak to the way that it ends up getting deferred and sort of like deferred or denied and pushed off and sort of into a future. And they speak to sort of like this way that the state has asserted asserts a monopoly on justice, or as it asserts a monopoly on violence. And that like kind of what that means for when we use the word justice, like how is it going to be bounded or contained, like what the horizon of that becomes. Yeah, and I thought that was kind of like a, how do I say this? Like, so I read this as like kind of, like again, like a probing, like how justice has operated. Jeremy, I'm wondering if there's something you want to leave it there. I didn't take, and maybe I misunderstood your response as not necessarily thinking about this piece.
I think my response was unfocused because of a general, just deep-seated distrust of a lot of this, a lot of the ways that these things are written down. I just really struggle to. I mean, a lot of the alternative conceptualizations of taking into account different identity groups and different community norms. A lot of the critiques of like homogeneous systems that treat that paint everyone with the same brush. They seem to be. They really read to me in this very concern trolling kind of way, where it's hard for me to imagine anyone benefiting from this special care taken to sort of coin new neologisms around their issues and the things that are decoupled from actual proposed changes to the social substrate that come with those notions. I don't really see as contentful, I guess. It doesn't seem to me like being told that there is a racial or gender identity component of crime in the U.S. that is not handled properly by the legal system. What good does that do the people affected by that lack of a thing, unless it's really forcibly trying to be directly tied to an actual concrete proposal to change something?
Matt, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think about how to respond to Jeremy. I mean, I think I have some sympathy with some common ground with you there around like there's something fucking stupid and frustrating about people who or about a theoretical discourse which ends up making careers for people instead of changing social systems or social conditions. I don't feel that way about this piece. And I think, I think it helps to be in Canada here maybe a little bit and to be closer to this notion of a truth and reconciliation process and all of its deficits. And I think like, let's step back for a second and think, what does the word justice mean to Indigenous people in Canada? It means a 200-year engagement with a system of laws which has systematically pretended shit, pretended to give a shit, pretended to be in the process of rectifying wrongs, while at the same time grinding down the people who are the plaintiffs in the legal process through a process of genocide. So that's, I think, what the colonial temporality is, for instance. It's a temporality, it's a deferral which makes permanent the wrong which the justice system pretends to be in the process of fixing. So that doesn't actually feel that abstract to me. I think what it says is, look, when we talk about justice, we're also it's also always, we Indigenous people know that there is no justice in the way that people imagine. There is no fairness, that there will never be fairness. We will continue to ask for it, but not because we think it is a possibility. And so this is a way to try to articulate what the practical attitude is of people or peoples who are actually engaged in struggles on a bunch of different, in a bunch of different ways, like practical struggles, some of them in the legal system, some of them, in the kind of court of public opinion, and some of them intellectual and artistic. It says, how are we to proceed with this concept of justice, which has basically only been a burden to us? What can we wrest from that concept that still serves us? So do you know what I mean? Like that, like it's not actually like heavy on the bullshit meter for me.
Maybe I'll just say one piece on there, which I think it also makes the point, which feels like a kind of relevant cautionary point, is like, and let's attend to the ways that by taking up this name of justice for a radical agenda, or like, if we're using justice as the banner under which we're trying to change things, like what is that doing to how we get to change things? Like, I think they sort of speak to that sort of at the end when they're talking about beyond justice, and they're sort of saying, hey, like what are the ways that this tool of justice has been taken up and reused and recycled? I think that's something like that again. Yeah, I mean, I would agree about how I read this piece. It feels similar, Matt, but I think it, offers a lot of insight, or like it stuck with me as something to like really reflect with. I saw Song and then Matt said.
So I felt a pretty strong connection between the first reading and the Nussbaum one, primarily because the first reading really insists upon the fact that their argument is that justice is necessarily confined within the state, and it's kind of a contingent on the state because the state facilitates it, the state determines the bounds within which justice can be defined, and so on. And so necessarily justice is neither a timeless nor a universal state of things that can ever be achieved proper within the bounds of the state. And it's related to their other point about the whole the Deleuzian desiring machines thing, where they say that, look, these things called states and state entities and organs of the government system and so on are not representational entities. They're not reflecting people's concepts and understandings of what justice is, but rather they're these kind of the machines that respond to the stimuli of the people's conceptions of what justice is, and then the actions that they take because of what they think justice is, completely independent of whether there is such a thing as justice per se. And so when Nussbaum says that the glaring defects of contractualist theories is exactly that, when they claim to make things best for the least well-off people, they're actually leaving out the really least well-off people who can't even who don't even have the capabilities of participating in contracts without support from some external entities. And so I think they were kind of getting at it from a really kind of obscure perspective, because they're kind of like putting together these different theories to get at what is happening in reality. But their point about I forgot the guy's name, but he takes it from Schmitt that state derives its power and sovereignty from its ability to decide when there's exceptions to the rules of law within the state, and it's kind of the complete opposite to the conventional way of thinking, where the state is just the thing that enforces laws or a reflection of what people think should be the rules, where because the state can decide what is the exception, they can also decide who is excluded from the ordinary notions of justice. And so people like indigenous people and people who have been left behind over hundreds of years of history of oppression are exactly the almost the foundations, well, not the foundations, too strong a word, maybe it's like a reflection of where exactly the state derives its sovereignty from, and therefore where the particular brand of justice that this particular state presents comes from. So I think that's the connection between the two readings.
Yeah, no, that was that helps. That's actually really great framing. And I want to just recognize Matt P's point, which goes all the way back to Matt said about, hey, let's think about contract and maybe bring that up to like smart contract, or how people think about contracts governing and governance within current decentralized tech. But so Matt said, I think you also had a point on this. So let's say one or two more points, or in our current moment. So if people have one or two more points they want to make kind of about the relationship between these readings, and then let's sort of maybe turn to thinking about tech, and we could use the way in of the decentralization smart contracts.
I had just raised my hand because I wanted to hear people talk about the connections between the first reading and Nussbaum's, and Matt P in the chat had sort of started opening up of like, I wonder if Nussbaum's theory actually addresses some of the things that they're raising in the first reading. So I'd be curious to hear more, or if we want to move on, we could skip it.
No, I would love if anyone has, I mean, I don't want to burden, but I'm kind of turning to Matt P here because you flagged it, but if anyone else kind of, I was also struck by thinking about the relationship of the two, and not knowing the way that song was, which is great. So yeah, maybe Matt P, or if anyone else, let's give a pause if anyone else wants to speak to that.
I think in both cases, like if you look at both, what do those two things bring against the full-on abstraction that Rawls represents? Like the notion of justice as a principle that puts everybody on the same footing. What they both say, I think, is it's the same footing is an illusion, and it's a pernicious illusion which allows people to be further hurt, allows existing marginalization and discrimination to be intensified. Like when you pretend to put people on the same footing, and what you're really doing much of the time is strengthening the structures that divide society into the kind of insiders and outsiders. So that's kind of roundabout. I feel like the place where Nussbaum most obviously might be able to like address some of Tuck and Yang is about the relationship of justice to the state. So if we no longer think of, if we are able somehow to imagine the social in social justice to extend beyond the borders of the state, and I think people, we try to do that. I think in a way, like kind of the anti-globalization movement is sort of a place where that becomes prominent. The notion that we are all bound, we should all be bound by the same rules. Like that what matters is not who is best and worst off in the USA or in France, but how what we do in North America affects people in other parts of the world too. But the Rawlsian theory anyway doesn't really allow you to do that usually in the way it's usually understood. So anyway, I feel like I'm going on so long. Like Nussbaum destabilizes or helps to undercut that state boundedness of the notion of justice or the extent of justice. The place where I think no analytic philosophy is going to help you is the kind of the relationship between justice and trauma, and grief. Like, and I feel like, like thinking about Black Lives Matter, you look at Black Lives Matter, I think it was also true in the civil rights movement that grief was this foundational part of the movement. It's it's an action undertaken to change social conditions, but it's also like a way to manage the incurable pain of injustice. And I don't think any account of justice that lays out a set of logical arguments is gonna get you to an understanding of, or like it's gonna get you to whatever it is that Tuck and Yang are kind of trying to express with that. But maybe I'm wrong.
I'll say one super brief thing here, which is I don't think so either. And I think there's, I think the analytic force of like philosophy or many modern analytic philosophy arguments does not have the emotional, feels like it doesn't, despite trying to maybe even in some cases address like an affective or emotional register, like doesn't like soothe or show care or respond to some of that stuff. Though Martha Nussbaum wrote a book called like Political Emotions, which is I think trying to bring in some of that stuff. So maybe we should read it or save some of that for later. And in the little time we have left, because we have 10 minutes, I wonder if we finally want to arrive at justice, at technology. And my attempt to go and get us there is kind of sort of redrawing the string that Matt Zed sort of put out about smart contracts, and also just say the one thing I had mentioned at the beginning that I think Nussbaum points to really effectively is like, look, this way of using a social contract like implicitly is carried through in a lot of the like maybe like institutions or cultures, or maybe the tech we build. It's like even sometimes like implicit in like the way we talk about how people are part of society. So I mean, around decentralization, I would say a contract-driven view seems prevalent, at least in blockchain space. And I don't know, Vincent, if you had another thought from there, or if other people wanted to add something.
I would just add there's like, it's in the blockchain space, it's not only a contract-driven view, it's a reductive notion of contracts. It's this, in the vast majority of cases I encounter, as in I have yet to encounter someone who is enthusiastic about applying smart contracts and feels very confident about it, who is not also embracing a really reductive notion of what governance or anything in that domain means and could be. And so it's sort of where even if we're extremely generous, you get to what Matt expressed at the end of what he was last saying, of even at its most refined and most extreme analytical philosophy seems inadequate when compared against the realities, right? And so if that's even or is that, Matt, is that a fair re-quoting of what you were saying? And so if that's even like the best of the best of the like abstracted attempts at getting nuance still feels inadequate, then when we look at these sort of, you can say that the technologies that are there right now with all these blockchains and things, obviously it's the kludgy very first glimmers of a technology, but even if you're extremely generous and you imagine it at its most refined, will it actually grapple with things in a way that is better than what we have built thus far? And I feel a pessimism about that, and I also feel concern about what is lost by embracing a system that is reductive and fundamentally reductive in its sense, and more utilitarian in its nature. And so I'm especially curious about parallels to things like utilitarianism versus Hayek's approach, versus like these different views of contractarian philosophy, I forget the term, versus what Nussbaum is putting forward, and like how those sort of might feed into this sort of smart contracts enthusiasm. And then there's also all like the questions about technologies that aren't about blockchains. What are the other opportunities there? Like what one of the readings speaks to in Detroit.
Yeah, maybe I'll just to augment that last part of what you said. I mean, I think what Diana Userra's work does is kind of say like, this is how we try and bring justice up alongside tech, which is maybe not the way that you would use a theory of justice to like evaluate. It's sort of like we use that way of like thinking with justice to come up with principles together. It just feels like it's about a process thing, not about like sort of like looking at whatever, like describing an outcome. Which I think maybe is something to keep in mind, but I also feel like there's a lot that I get really stuck on, which has come up before, is about like how do we actually grapple with the intended values that are embedded in technology, and then sort of the unintended ones, or the kind of consequences that come from that, whether it's just blockchain or not. Jeremy, I think I saw your hand, that little hand thing go up.
Yeah, so my thought was about, so I was beginning to type in the chat, but my thought was about, I guess, there's this hole that it's easy to fall down when a new technology seems to stand to become a more general drop-in substitute for something that previously was not mechanized or not automated or not otherwise made trustless, for instance, or given to an oracle like a DAO. And so if you think about it, how people talk about DAOs, they usually talk about them in some really odd sense of basically imagining them as like court and executioner and law enforcement and everything in between. They imagine them as if they are systems that can't be just walked around in the event of any kind of dispute with what the system has maybe adjudicated, for instance. And that seems like the entire discussion becomes about the failure mode of thinking that way and becoming sort of lensed by the idea that, like, can the technological substitute do all the things versus thinking, can it do more than you would otherwise have available? Because you can never repo a car with a DAO. You just can't do it. And there, a disembodied algorithm can't put a boot on a car. It's not going to happen. So it seems like there's a lot of talking past each other, where people who are enthusiastic for trying to see how the new systems are built, they don't really even talk to a much extent about the same things as the people who are critiquing the notion that you would only ever have just the system.
Just a time check. Thank you for that. So we have like three minutes left, and I don't really have any wrap up because this is our last session. Except that we'll advertise anyone welcome to join and offer feedback other ways. We're going to chat and help think for rebooting a slightly different, hopefully better version of this next year. But so in the moments we have left, I'm wondering if folks, and maybe mindful that I've spoken a lot this time, folks who haven't said anything, if they have anything they want to add, or if there's something kind of critical that felt like it wasn't covered that you wanted to flag.
I felt like there was, Kelsey, you go.
It's kind of a tangent right at the end, but I've been thinking a lot, Matt, about what you said earlier about the social contract as formulated with non-persons who have an absence of proclivities. And I've been reading a lot of meditation theory lately. And one of the things that's really interesting about that is, like, there was a quote in one of the books that I was reading along the lines of, the goal is to have no preference. And in that sense, it flips this, like, in the state where justice is emotional and something that we will never achieve, if you as an individual want to reduce your cognitive dissonance with the inherent injustice of a social contract-based system, you have to become this kind of non-person. I thought that was kind of a, like, flipped, weird version of that.
Dude, that displaced my thought. I've always thought, like, the virtue of equanimity is so far from the virtues that I am used to believing in, that I just can't assimilate it. The thing I want to say was, I just felt like even though that Detroit piece was not as hard and not as, like, like you wouldn't be found in a seminar in a philosophy department or whatever, I really liked it. Because it tried to ask, like, what does it take to get to, building just technologies? And part of it, the answer is not necessarily always super complicated. Part of the answer is paying attention to people. It's not complicated. It's just that so many of us are so shitty at it, right? And in Edgy, like, we struggle with our shittiness at it. That's one of our struggles. And so I guess I felt attuned to that when I heard that. So I wanted to hear more about it.
I think the hearing more about it is something that we could tackle at a future reading group, because I feel like there's so much there, and there's sort of like this really cool, actually almost like history of like circuit riders, so people who are doing like tech for nonprofits around social or like social change or grassroots organizations, and particularly like activists. And then also some of the, like, I think referenced there, CUP, Center for Urban Pedagogy. Like there's so many touchstones in there, which I think would be wonderful. This is my subtle way of transitioning us to a close and inviting all of you to also think about things that we should imagine reading together into the future. And so at the end of many of the reading sessions that we had, we came up with future threads that we didn't get to talk about. I mean, I feel like there's a couple more here today. I've been pulling them all together into one mega issue in the GitHub repo for, I'm not going to get there in time. No, for the GitHub repo for this. So it's github.com data together. So it's the data together / reading data together. And we're gonna also do some more brainstorming on that over time, so it's not a hard edge. The one thing I wanted to flag as another topic was what Matt Zed brought up about kind of almost like I'm thinking of how Tim Ingold kind of talks about it, which is the grain of technology, like this sort of way that things get reduced by their translation into the building of technology. Like I think that's such a, there's a lot in there that I think kind of came out of today. And then Jeremy's question about Protocol Labs General Counsel. We said we were going to do it after this. We're good to go. We were just going to confirm a date, same time slot. So it's going to be a Tuesday at 3:30 p.m. Eastern.
Yeah, and roughly a month out. Like, so it stays with the regular pace, or is that's more of a question?
So we have the Data Together coordinating meeting is next this time slot. So it's Tuesday, November 6th. I would imagine that we don't want to get into December because people are going to be busy. So I mean, furthest out would be a month, right? That would be end of November. And then also by the end of the year, in the same time slot, we want to add in a more casual, open to anyone, like reflection, brainstorming for next year call. So can I, on the Data Together email thing, float a couple dates, or you confirm the dates that would work for, I've lost
I think it'll help if we request a date, Marvin. Yeah. So like if we maybe aim for that following week after the 6th. So
sure.
13th-ish.
Yeah, let's do that.
And see if that works for him, and otherwise we'll iterate.
Awesome. I'm gonna just say a huge thank you to everyone for coming on this reading journey together. And it's been so great. And I'm excited to keep reading with you all. I'm gonna stop recording now.